I'd like to shift gears for a moment here and talk about interactions. Organisms interact with a lot of stuff. This snail, for example, interacts with the rough surface of the rocks that it crawls over. It interacts with the waves that pound down on those rocks and maybe try to knock it into the ocean when the tide comes in. It interacts with the seaweed that it eats for dinner, and it interacts indirectly with this snail which ate the seaweed that it was hoping to eat for dinner. The snail hopes not to interact with a hungry green crab, but it might have to deal with that too. All of these interactions are the subject of the science that we call ecology. Ecology essentially is the study of the interactions that living things take part in. The ecology of an organism is tremendously closely intertwined with its evolution. It's the challenges of the outside world that weed out organisms that don't do well. That's what natural selection is. And all of those challenges are an organism interacting with something, whether it's a non-living something like temperature, or whether it's a living something like a snail interacting with a green crab. One of the results of all of this is that certain species are found in particular locations, and they're found there in particular numbers. This is basically what ecology is about. What are the factors that determine where we find organisms and how many of them we find there? One of the rules that you want to keep in mind that is a result of evolution and ecology together is this mantra, which basically you can think of as the 3 F's. Form follows function. For most of the features or traits of an organism that are interesting, they are the way that they are. That is, they're formed the way that they are because they serve a particular function. Bird beaks are an excellent example of this. So, for example, the toucan here has this large but very light bill for reaching way out to the ends of branches and plucking fruit from ends of branches that are too small for it to walk on. This crossbill has this peculiar beak because it helps it pry open pine cones and get the seeds inside. This bird down here, this is a merganser. It has a beak with tiny little teeth that help it hold on to the fish that it eats. This is an African hornbill. I have no idea why it has a beak that looks like that, but it probably has some strange function that I don't know about. In general, it's a rule that organisms look and behave the way that they do because those features function to help the organism overcome some kind of challenge. Every living thing has evolved to meet certain challenges. And the flip side of this, you could say, is that every living thing has certain needs that have to get met if it's going to survive. Your book talks about the ecological niche as something like the job an organism does. But I actually like a different way of thinking about the ecological niche, a different way of defining the ecological niche. I think it's more useful. This other definition of a niche defines an organism's niche as the set of conditions or things it needs in order to make a living. So, for example, this is the red-cockaded woodpecker over here. It needs a longleaf pine forest with various ages of trees so that it can find old snags to nest in. It needs a certain amount of calcium in the soil so that it gets enough calcium in its food to make eggshells. It needs to eat ants, which means that it needs certain caterpillars to go and mine out tunnels under the bark that those ants then go live in. It needs a certain range of temperatures. It can't deal with temperatures that are too hot, can't deal with temperatures that are too cold. All together, all of these factors put together can be said to be the niche of the red-cockaded woodpecker. And you're only going to find red-cockaded woodpeckers in locations and situations where all of these factors are present. Some organisms are called generalists. Here's an excellent example of a generalist. This is a raccoon. You've probably met them. Um, they have a niche that is very, very broad. That is, they're very able to survive and reproduce under a whole range of circumstances. So the common raccoon can eat all kinds of things. It can eat birds' eggs or crayfish or acorns or your trash. They can find places to nest in forests or brush, or they can even nest in lone trees in the suburbs. As a result, they are found over a very broad geographic range. Now, the geographic range is not the same thing as the niche. In contrast, this is an animal that's closely related to the raccoon. It's called an olingito, and it's a specialist. The olingito spends basically all of its time in trees. So it has to have large numbers of trees. It has to have specific kinds of trees, and it's only found in a certain elevational range in the Andean cloud forest. That is the cloud forest of South America. So because this animal needs very specific things, it's found in a very narrow location. This organism has a broad niche. It doesn't need nearly as many specific things, and so it's found over a very broad location. The difference between generalists and specialists, as we'll mostly encounter in this class, is that specialists tend to be more at risk of extinction. It's going to be very difficult, even if we tried, to drive the common raccoon extinct. We'd basically have to pave all of North America in asphalt. However, this organism's needs are very specific, and to date, about 40% of the places in the world where it even can make a living have been destroyed. So it's much, much closer to the brink of extinction. Okay, that's it for the lectures for today. Be sure that you take the quiz that follows this lecture and do the preparation questions before you come to the next class session.